Now in our study of the General Epistles, we next come to the book of James. As we begin the book of James, let me read you a passage out of John to begin our study of the book of James. John chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. Now, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. His brethren therefore said unto him, Depart hence and go into Judea, that thy disciples also may see the works that thou doest. For there is no man that doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly. If thou do these things, show thyself to the world. They're kind of prodding Jesus and making fun of him. His brethren are. Verse 5 says, For neither did his brethren believe in him. And certainly James is one. By way of introduction, let me first give you, before we go into the introduction, the outline which we will follow as we go through our study in James. James is a book that talks much about bringing the Christian to maturity. So we will play upon that theme, and our points will be thus. Number 1, suffering makes a mature man. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 20. Scripture study makes for a mature man. That's chapter 1, 19, 20, 22, 25, those verses there. Thirdly, sincerity makes a mature man. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. Fourthly, Christian service makes a mature man. Chapter 2, verses 14 to 26. Fifthly, sound speech makes a mature man. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 18. Sixth, submission to God makes a mature man. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. 7, self-sacrifice makes a mature man. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. 8, steadfastness makes a mature man. Chapter 5, verse 7 through verse 11. 9th, supplication makes a mature man. Chapter 5, verses 12 through 18. And 10th, and lastly, soul winning makes for a mature man. That's chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. Now, as we go into our introduction, I read you the verse that Jesus' brethren said to him, Go into Judea. And it says that Jesus did not walk in Jewry. He didn't hang around Judaism because they were seeking to kill him. His brethren said to him, Go down there. I mean, if you're wanting to be known as the Messiah, what are you doing down here in secret doing things? Go show yourself to the world. It said in verse 5 of John 7, For neither did his brethren believe in him. Now, James, the author of this book, is the oldest half-brother of Jesus Christ. We often contend with the Catholics over many of their teachings, one being the perpetual virginity of Mary, that she not only gave virgin birth to Jesus Christ, but she remained a virgin. That'd be very difficult to do, seeing that Jesus had 2, 3, 4 brothers and several sisters. The references given, every Christian ought to know where these are. Mark chapter 6 and verse 3. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judah, and Simon? There's 4. And are not his sisters, plural, at least 2, here with us? And they were offended at him. In Matthew 13:55 it said, Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brethren, James, Joseph, Simon, Judah? We know this man, and we know his family. This can't be the Messiah. But James was the oldest half-brother of Jesus Christ. Later in our study, we will study the book of Jude. Jude and James are brothers, and they are both half-brothers of Jesus Christ, full brothers of each other. And the text and the New Testament teaches us that James was an unbeliever prior to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, his brethren did not believe in him, John 7:5. James is his brethren. And so James and Jude, they didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. I can imagine how hard it must have been growing up in a home with Jesus Christ. And they thought, well, he's always had this holier-than-thou attitude. I mean, Mary and Joseph always say, why can't you be more like your older brother Jesus? I mean, he doesn't get in all this trouble you boys get into. I mean, I can imagine it was difficult. But when he pronounced himself to be the Messiah and made an open public ministry, his brethren did not believe him. How could you be the Messiah? I mean, you came from our family. It just can't be. But then sometime after the resurrection, James is saved. Paul talks about the appearances of Jesus Christ after the resurrection. And one stop Jesus made, 1 Corinthians 15:7. And after that, he says, he was seen of us, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once. He was seen of me, lastly born as one out of due time. He was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. And then there's this verse, 1 Corinthians 15:7. After that, he was seen of James. So evidently, when Jesus came up from the dead, one stop he made was a personal visit to his brother, James. Now, James, when he gets saved, I would say really gets gung-ho. James, when he gets called of God and really sees Jesus Christ and who he is, James gets on fire for the Lord, and history tells us that James actually became probably the first pastor of Jerusalem. Certainly when Paul is going to and from Jerusalem, and much of the book of Acts, it indicates, like in Acts chapter 12, verse 17, that James is the person in charge of the Jewish council at Jerusalem and probably the pastor of the church. It is thought that this epistle is the very first of the New Testament books written around 45 A.D. The synagogue, rather than the church, is mentioned as a place of meeting, and thus it was still written while the church was just pulling away from Judaism. Many believe that this is the most Jewish book in the New Testament, the book of James. Unger said in Unger's Bible Handbook, if several passages referring to Christ were removed, the whole epistle would be as proper in the canon of the Old Testament as it would in the New Testament. In fact, the epistle could be described as an interpretation of the Old Testament law and the Sermon on the Mount in light of the gospel of Christ. So Unger certainly thought it was a very Jewish book. Some call it the Proverbs of the Old Testament. Now, James had quite a reputation. James was known as a man of unusual prayer life. Many called James old camel knees. It is said that he spent so much time in prayer that his knees became hard and calloused and heavy skin around his knees like that of a camel's because he spent so much time in prayer. He's often called James the Just. Like Jude, the other half-brother of Jesus Christ, James does not pull his rank when he opens his book. When he opens, he'll open James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. He does not say, I am James, Jesus' brother, and certainly know much more about this than many of you would know because I lived with him. He did not pull rank. Instead, he says, I'm a servant of Jesus Christ. Quite a change in attitude from someone who didn't believe in him while Jesus was upon this earth. Also, there are 53 Old Testament references in the Epistle of James. James is not that long of an epistle. And to have 53 indirect quotes or references back to the Old Testament is about one in every other verse. James, like the preaching of Jesus Christ, James loved to use Old Testament characters. And he loved to relate them to New Testament things. He loved to use nature illustrations. He used Old Testament characters. In James 2:21, he used Abraham and Isaac. Was not Abraham justified by works when he'd offered Isaac, his son, upon the altar? Old Testament character. He used Rahab the harlot in James 2:25. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? He used Job in James 5:11. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You've heard of the patience of Job, and you have seen that the end of the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. He used Elijah in chapter 5, verse 17. Elijah was a man subject to like passions, just like we are, but he prayed earnestly that it might not rain, and it rained not on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. He used many Old Testament characters, but then he liked to use those nature illustrations. He said in chapter 1, they're like wind-tossed waves of the sea. He said they are like withering grass and fading flowers. Our life is so short. He used the illustration of fire and the tongue in chapter 3. He used the illustration of fountains of water sending forth sweet and bitter in regard to our speech in 3:11. He talked about figs and olives in 3:12. He talked about sowing and harvesting. That is one of Jesus Christ's great topics. The parable of the sower, one of the greats. Talked about sowing and reaping, chapter 3, verse 18. Talked about early and latter rains, which goes along with those same themes, chapter 5, verse 7. And he talked about drought, chapter 5, verse 17. Some have said that there is contradiction between the work of James and that of Paul. I would say it's an imagined contradiction. They say this because Paul preaches and teaches that we are justified by faith, whereas James comes on the scene saying, you see then that a man by works is justified and not by faith only. But these two men are not contradicting one another. They are giving a full complement to each other. For we are justified before God by our faith, not by works. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So we're justified before God, or we are saved by our faith in Jesus Christ. But yet, the common man, the people we're around every day, how will they know what lies within our heart unless they see some external, some physical works that we will do to manifest the change that has happened in us? And James comes along and says to be justified before our brethren and before this world we must do good works. And you see that how not just by faith, but faith before God, but works before our fellow man. We are justified in their eyes. Now, Martin Luther really did not like the book of James. He called it a right strawy epistle because of this. And furthermore, I would say that James and Paul do not contradict one another because of the fellowship they had together. You know, when Peter and Paul had some contentions, Paul withstood Peter to the face in Acts, and they just pretty much had it out, and it just dealt with their problem. Now, you don't find that contention between Paul and James, so I don't think their works disagreed. Paul and James met during Paul's first trip to Jerusalem after his Damascus Road conversion. It told us about that in Galatians chapter 1. It said, after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. And of the other apostles saw I none, save James, the Lord's brother. So Paul just gets converted. Think about this. And so Paul wants to know all he can about Christianity and Jesus Christ. So who does Paul go to see? First, Paul goes to see Simon Peter. You say, why Peter? Well, Peter's pretty much the one in charge at this point. James has just been converted a little while. Peter has been given the admonition, when thou art converted, strengthen the brethren. Peter's been given the admonition, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. And so Peter was there every moment. He was part of the inner circle of three. He was on the Mount of Transfiguration. He was there for every miracle. Nobody knew the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ any better than Simon Peter. And if you wanted to know about the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ, who would you go see? You'd go see Simon Peter. What was it like in the upper room, Peter? Now, when he preached, was it expository? Was it verse by verse? Did he preach to a text, from a text? Now, Peter, when he gave the invitation, how did he do it? Man, Paul wanted to know everything there was to know about Jesus Christ. Now, if you want to know about the earthly life of Christ, not just his ministry, Peter told you about that, but really, what was Jesus the man like? Well, who would know better than his half-brother, James? So, Paul says, I went to see Peter, and then I went to see James. James could tell you everything about the home life of Jesus Christ. James was there. James, how did Jesus treat Mary? How did Jesus treat Joseph? How did Jesus run the family business? What was his work ethic like? Now, what he professed publicly, was that the same thing he did at home when nobody could see him? And so when Paul talked to those two men, you could know in just a few hours and days almost everything there was to know about the earthly life of Jesus and his ministry. So I don't think Paul and James were in any contradiction whatsoever. Also, he conferred with Paul during his last trip to Jerusalem, found in Acts chapter 21. And a lot of people say, some traditions say, that shortly before Jerusalem was destroyed, when many, many Jews were accepting Jesus Christ and just really turning the city upside down, that the high priest Annas, the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin, and they called James, the pastor of the church at Jerusalem, in, and they asked James to publicly renounce Jesus Christ as Israel's Messiah. And when he refused, it is said that they took James out and they threw him from the pinnacle of the temple, which is a long drop. And when he hit the ground, it broke his body, but it did not totally kill him. And upon that, all the people ran outside, and they took stones, and they stoned him as he lay dying from the fall. If it be true that he surely died a martyr's death, as did the other apostles. Now, in this book, the word perfect is found many, many times. It's a word that is very similar to our word mature, and hence the outline that I gave you. We will be talking about maturity and what brings the Christian to maturity. We do this now in point number 1. Chapter 1, verse 1, we begin. Point 1, suffering makes a mature man. Where does this suffering come from? I mean, what are the external things that cause suffering? Well, in chapter 1, verse 12, it says, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life." And that talks about that. Verse 2 says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations and trials." Now, these verses speak of a couple of different things, two different kinds of suffering. There are trials and there are temptations. It says that God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. So I'll choose my words, try to choose them carefully. Sometimes we use trials and temptations interchangeably, but the Lord will allow trials to come in our lives. The text, though, says that the Lord does not tempt us to sin. He cannot be tempted, and he does not tempt us to sin. Now, the devil does. So let me take, first of all, there are two types of suffering in the Christian life. Trial sufferings. These come from God. And when the Lord allows us to go through a trial, it is not for our hurt. It is for our betterment. And I would say that it's to bring us to maturity. It's to purify us. It's to cleanse the dross out of our lives. That is testing at the hand of God. A lot of people would run over to the Old Testament, and rightly so, they would bring up the passages that talk about, the Lord said, "I will tempt Abraham." And that's found in Genesis 22. It came to pass, God did tempt Abraham and said, "Take thy son, thine only son Isaac, and offer him upon Mount Moriah." Well, that temptation is not a temptation to sin, but it was a test. It was a trial. And it was not meant for Abraham's harm. It was meant for his betterment. Now, the other side of the coin is this. There are temptation sufferings which come from the devil, and they are sent to bring out the worst in us. The devil would have us fall and stumble. He would have us fail. He would have us sin against God. Some have said that trial and temptation are the opposite sides of the same coin. Sometimes God will allow trials to come into our life for our betterment, while at the same time Satan is working on the other hand to cause us to fall and stumble. Certainly the life of Job could be looked at that way. "Have you considered my servant Job?" Satan said, "Let me get to him. God, I'm going to tempt him." God said, "Go ahead." And God allowed the trial, but Satan gave the temptation, and Job came through a better man. Now, the characteristics of this suffering. Sometimes Christian suffering can come upon us suddenly. Chapter 1, verse 2 said, "When ye fall into divers temptations." A fall is something that happens very quickly. So the characteristics of suffering are, they're often sudden. James said if you were saved, he said when you fall, not if you fall, indicating that in every Christian life there would be some sort of testing. There would be trials that would come. Job said this, "Man is a few days and full of trouble." Job had it right, I believe. "Yea, all that live godly shall suffer persecution." I believe that also. So trials can come sudden. Trials are certain. And trials are sorted. It says divers, all different kind, various. That means we can go through trials of finances, trials of health, trials that are spiritual, trials that are mental, trials that are social, trials of kinfolk, trials of church members, trials in our workplace, all types of trials, divers trials. What is the purpose of suffering? Well, we've already stated that we believe suffering comes to bring us to maturity. But specifically, let me say this. Suffering in us produces endurance here. Chapter 1, verse 3. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. So it brings down here, suffering brings here on this earth, endurance. Secondly, suffering brings the promise of reward in heaven. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Chapter 1 and verse number 12. Now, what is our attitude in suffering? When these trials and temptations come, with what attitude do we face them? This will determine whether we're going to be a perpetual babe or if we're going to mature on in the Lord. How do we respond? He says this, chapter 1, verse 2, My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations. Now, we preach a lot of things from the pulpit, and I guess there is not many sermons that are much harder to live than this verse right here. When you fall into temptations, be joyful, which is exactly the opposite of normal human response. I mean, when we fall into temptation, joy is not the first thing that springs to mind. But he said, the more mature we become in Christ, we'll realize that the trial and the temptation are making us more like Christ. And if we go through it, the dross is consumed and the gold and the silver is refined, and we come forth a better vessel. Secondly, Scripture study makes a mature man. Now, God the Father has given us every good and perfect gift, it says, verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness. We saw that in Hebrews. Neither shadow of turning. Of his own will begat us of the word of truth. So we see that one thing that came down from God, of course every perfect gift does, but the word of truth came down. God gave us this Bible. Now, this Bible has given us new birth. Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. The believer is to read it carefully. We're to look into the perfect law of liberty and continue therein, and not be forgetful hearers, but doers of the work, verse 25. We're to heed it very carefully. Point 3. Sincerity also makes a mature man. Chapter 2 begins this thought. What is the root of insincerity, or what is the basis that he would even talk about sincerity or insincerity? Well, he opens up and he says, if there come a person into your assembly, a man with a gold ring and goodly apparel, and there come in also a poor man in vile raiment, and ye have respect to him that weareth the gay clothing, and you say to him, sit thou here in a good place. You say to the poor man, stand thou there, or sit here under my footstool. Verse 4, are ye not then partial in yourselves, and are become judges of evil thoughts? So he begins to talk to us about our sincerity. And he says the root of insincerity is being partial to the rich people or to the well-heeled crowd. And the fruits that this insincerity yield are sin. It says if ye have respect to persons, ye commit sin. Point number 4. Christian service also makes a mature man. Now, does James contradict Paul? We took this discussion up in the beginning. Here's where it really comes to bear. Does Christian service, when James says you must be justified by works, contradict with Paul's you must be justified by faith? I don't think so. He says this, what profit it, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him? Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. A man may say, thou hast faith, and I have works. Show me thy faith without thy works. I will show thee my faith by my works. Now, I believe that is the whole crux of the matter. We are justified before God by faith. But in order for me to be able to win my fellow man and to be a good soul winner, I cannot live like the devil, profess to be a Christian, and be an effective soul winner. No one will believe I'm a Christian. I believe it was Gandhi who said that the Christian life and Christian principles are great. And he said, you know, I probably would have been a Christian, with this caveat, had I never met one. Now, you say, why was he never persuaded to be a Christian? Because he knew some of us, and we were not doing with works what we claim by faith to do. We had been justified before God, but before our fellow man we had not lived rightly. And James said if we're going to come to maturity, then we are going to have to let our outward walk match our talk. Now, he gives some Old Testament patterns to illustrate this. I might say also under the same point. Some have said these texts are not meant to be taken as saving texts, but sign texts. The saving text given by Paul, of course, the famous Romans road to salvation, and then the sign text of salvation in James. Some have said the old-fashioned statement, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. And if our walk does not match our Christian profession, what good is it, James says? All right, the pattern. James gives two Old Testament people now to illustrate this point that he is making, that faith works with your works and shows you have justified before God and justified before man to bring a mature Christian to bear. The first of these illustrations is Abraham. He says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? And the answer is yes. Now think about Abraham's justification here. Abraham was justified before God around the age of about 85 in Genesis 15 and 16. But he was justified before man at about the age of 137 in Genesis chapter 22 and 23. So, justified before God, and then the works followed, and you have a mature Christian. He points out Rahab, who's a very unlikely character to teach maybe one of these great deep truths off of, Rahab the harlot. Likewise, he says in chapter 2, verse 25, was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she had received the messengers and had sent them out another way? Now, he tells us, think about Rahab. Her salvation is recorded in Joshua 2:14, and her service is recorded in Joshua 2:15 and 16. So, Ryrie said in the Ryrie Study Bible this, he said, unproductive faith cannot save because it is not genuine faith. Faith and works are like a two-coupon ticket to heaven. The coupon of works is not good for passage. We all understand salvation is not by works. But the coupon of faith is not valid if it's detached from the coupon of works. And I would say that's a fairly valid argument. Now, we begin point number 5. Sound speech makes for a mature man. This argument begins in chapter 3 and verse 1. Now, chapter 3 and verse 1 is a very important statement for Bible teachers. I do well to read it for myself and for you. My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. And I would say to us as Bible teachers and pastors and youth directors and people who stand before people and declare the Word of God, there be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. We better be very careful when we stand and say, thus saith the Lord. Say, why? You're speaking for God. And if you say something that God didn't say, you're going to bear your punishment. So we must proceed with a word of caution because there is of course we're going to talk about the tongue in this chapter. And if anybody, Paul said, I'm a fool for Christ's sake. Why? Because a fool shoots off his mouth all the time, and I'm always talking. A preacher's always talking. He's bound to make a mistake somewhere along the way, and we should be cautious. The importance of the tongue. As we begin this discussion on the tongue, I must say that the tongue is a very important member. And one thing we need to note about the tongue is connected to the heart. Jesus said, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Says, a man thinks in his heart, out of the heart come the issues of life. And whatever you think eventually will show up in your mouth, on your tongue, and in your speech. If you have hatred in your heart, eventually it'll manifest itself in your mouth. If you have bitterness in your heart, eventually it'll manifest itself in your mouth and in your speech. And if you have love in your heart, eventually it'll manifest itself in your speech. And you cannot hide what is in the heart. Now, he gives many illustrations of the tongue. I believe we'll end this session right here, and when we pick this session up again, we'll begin with illustrations of the tongue as James equates our tongue to the bit in the horse's mouth and the rudder of the ship. And we'll bring our next discussion forward with that illustration.